Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod. I've got Rachael Stark back in the house, and you know what that means. We have more martial mayhem incoming. And today we are doing the bravest of the brave. The guy who certainly had balls, but maybe had some brains. I don't know. I'm a bit ambivalent about Ney's brain level because there are moments when he does show brains and there are moments when he really doesn't. So sort of a bit Murat-esque in places, but not always. That's my uninformed assessment that I'm going to go with. Though fortunately, Rachel is nodding along, at least politely, as if to say, "You might be an imbecile, Zach, but I'm not going to offend you on your own show." Rachel, great to see you again. How are you doing? How would you kind of subtitle this one?
Do you know, I was thinking of a soundbite for this earlier on, when we said you do know decent but dim, and obviously we had a bit of a joke with Mira. Ney is really difficult to categorize, I feel, because he does go from being, a living legend almost in Russia, and performing really, really well in the early days of the empire, but he's a guy who sort of swings about a bit. He's a very mercurial character, and there are times where he performs brilliantly, and there are times where he is erratic and incredibly quarrelsome and really, really difficult. So he's a bit like Napoleon in the sense that he has real peaks and troughs in his career. So I've not thought of a good soundbite for him yet. We'll maybe get one as we go through the show.
I'm sure we will, and no doubt people will beseech me to stick it on a mug. I am working on merch, people, but it's complicated and irritating. But Murat, all balls and no brains, is absolutely going to have to go on the side of a mug at some point in time. Stay posted. Stay posted. I'll keep you posted. Something like that. Keep an eye out. Words will come out of my mouth at some point when the time arrives. Um, so Ney, in some respects, his own worst enemy, particularly late in his life when it
Mhm.
comes to his death. Obviously, we'll get there in due course. Nobody can question his bravery. I would always have said nobody could question his loyalty either. But actually, as those words are coming out of my mouth, I'm kind of thinking 1814 to 15. He sort of jumps one way and then the other. And again, that's all a bit complicated. We'll get to that in due course. Let's do the predictable thing. No, before we do the predictable thing, what would you say is the common perception of Nate? Because for me, it's dominated by Bravest of the Brave. That's how everybody
Yeah.
thinks of him. That's what he's famous for. And yet, Bravest of the Brave is in reality sort of a bit of a, I don't know if poison chalice is quite the right word for it, but he gets that because of a fundamentally a cock up, right? He gets cut off and he fights his way out, brave as hell. But that's it's one of those situations where, well, A, you shouldn't really have got cut off, should you? And then B, sure, he fought his way out, but not with many men left. So he's a complex one for me, but I do have this impetuous thing kind of overriding everything. And no doubt Geraint will be coming in and talking about those moments in 1811 when Ney manages to turn around and give Wellington a bit of a bloody nose. So there you go, Geraint. I've name checked you. Yeah, so apologies for the waffle there, but that's just sort of my confused picture of
Mm.
Ney. And I'm not sure that actually reading the Chandler chapter helped too much in sort of shifting that perception. What's your take? You're the expert here, not me.
Well, not expert, enthusiast. But Ney is perceived as, very in the public imagination. From my experience, he's perceived as the heroic one. I remember when I started doing the Marshal Monday features on my Twitter account. Sometimes it was threads and sometimes it was polls, and I asked people, even knowing what you do now, knowing the full Napoleonic epic, knowing how it ended, knowing what happened, who is the marshal you'd most want to follow into battle? And Ney walked it by a country mile. A lot of people said, well, my head says I should follow Davout. Heart says Ney. I mean, Lang got a few votes, a couple of votes pitched for Murat, but Ney walked it by a country mile. And I think that kind of marries up with what you see in his career. didn't always make the decisions that seemed to be the most logical, didn't always behave the way he should have behaved. But if you wanted a guy who could inspire men, who could instill them with the conviction that they could win, who could lead by example, and who could, really just set a rocket up people and get them to give their all, Michel Ney was the man.
I wonder how much of popular perception is also influenced by the fact that you've got the 1970 Sergei Bondarchuk Waterloo, right, which is very much sort of Ney, the hero figure, the guy who struggles a bit in terms of the loyalties, but endlessly brave. The guy who knows how to inspire people. Do you think that is part of what shapes it, or actually is the Ney legend? Because this is the other thing that strikes me, that if you were to try and Hollywoodify Ney, you'd just come out with Ney in real life. That's very much my read of it. You can't
Yeah,
really amplify this guy.
no. Ney's life, that if you try to summarize Ney's life, it essentially is like one long drama. It's full of, highs and lows, and just when you think he's given everything and he's going to fail and all's going to be lost in Russia, he comes back out swinging again. And it really is. I mean, I know we've in the Twitter community, we've all discussed a few times, how many Hollywood movies could we make out of the Napoleonic era? There could be plenty, and obviously very topical at the moment. I'm interested to see. I noticed Ney is one of the few named marshals in the new Napoleonic film, so I'm quite interested to see how they're going to portray him then. But I mean, yeah, Ney's story needs no dramatizing. It's got plenty drama.
Okay, so let's actually dig into the nuts and bolts rather than me waffle on about sort of memory and popular perception, even though it does interest me. He's it's an exaggeration to say he's born into a military family. I wonder if that perhaps is kind of overstating it a bit. But he comes from, again, military pedigree is probably overstating it as well. But he's son of a veteran, put it that way,
Yeah.
right?
His father, Pierre Ney, is a veteran of the 7 Years' War. And Ney was born in Saarlouis, which was a border town between the French and German borders, which would come to be particularly relevant towards the end of his life. But he therefore grew up bilingual. The family spoke German at home and he learned French at school. He was, as I say, Pierre Ney was a veteran of the 7 Years' War. So it's not unlikely that Ney grew up hearing stories of battles and soldiering life and comradeship and so on. He was one of four children. His eldest brother was called Jean, then Michel Ney was the second child, the third, Jacques, died very young, and they had a sister, Marguerite. And Pierre Ney had come out of the 7 Years' War and had set himself up as a cooper, a barrel cooper, and was successful enough that he could afford to give his children a decent education, and he had careers in mind for them. The idea was that Jean, as eldest son, would inherit the business and would take over the running of that, and Michel was destined for a clerical career. But you know what they say about best laid plans? Actually, both his sons would end up in the army. And it wasn't really until today when I was kind of prepping, jotting down a few notes, that it really kind of hit me. Pierre Ney, so he had four children, as I say, he died in 1826. He lived a very long life.
No
Ney's eldest
way.
Ney's eldest brother died at the Tribia in 1799. Ney, of course, in 1815, and their sister in 1819. So he was predeceased by all of his children, which obviously
Oh
is
God.
tremendously sad. But to live to see your son ascend to the heights that he did and then lose it all must have been, a tremendous strain.
That's horrendous. And
Yeah.
especially the nature of the story, as a father sort of watching on, you see particularly somebody like Michel Ney, the one that we were always going to refer to as Ney, um, as you say, climb those heights and risk so much, right? It's not like this guy isn't in the thick of it all the damn
Mhm,
time.
mhm.
Um, comes through it sufficient. I mean, not totally unscathed, but sufficiently unscathed that he's fighting fit, and yet to end as it does post Waterloo, that's horrendous. The stress that must have wrought on him as much as anything else is awful. Interesting, another one who's destined for the church and just doesn't. I don't know what it is about some of our marshals, but it seems to be a thing. Is it second sons? Is that part of what's going on here? Because
He's
this is where
second
Rory
son, sorry, but
Muir's.
I meant clerical in terms of office rather than church.
Okay.
He's um slightly more, secretarial bent, but a bit like, as I said with Murat, I couldn't think of somebody less suitable for the church. I can't think of a man less suited to be a clerk and sit in an office and live a sort of sedentary, calm, boring life than Michel Ney.
Yeah, no, it's not consistent, is it? I also wanted to pick up on what you said about how he's born in this border town, and the immediate sort of connection that goes on in my mind is, so have we got somebody here who, a bit like Napoleon, has this thing in their life of, what am I? Well, in the early stages of their life, of what am I? Am I French? Am I whichever is the nearest German state? I mean, my gut would say that it's probably Hanoverian, but that's probably wrong. My 1760s geography is poor, I regret to say. But does he have that problem, inverted commas, in his life that Napoleon has, of trying to work out which side of the border he identifies with, especially if he's speaking German at home and then learning French at school because he's got to?
As far as I can tell, no. He was very much, I am a Frenchman and a very proud Frenchman at that. At one point in his career, when he's away from his wife, he writes, "What a glorious thing it is to be a Frenchman." And obviously, we will come to the trial later. But when his lawyer wanted to, at which point Tsar Louis was ceded to Prussia, to sort of say, well, technically speaking, that makes him a Prussian citizen, and so you can't really try him by a French court. Even offered a loophole that would save his life. Ney's having none of it. I am French. I will remain French. I'll die a Frenchman. So I don't think he ever seemed to have a identity crisis of that nature.
We'll touch on whether or not that's principles or bravery or stubbornness or pride or all of the above in due course. My money's on all of the above in a number of respects. So he doesn't toe the line, but he enlists pre-revolution, so he ends
Mm-hmm.
up being a hussar.
Yes.
How does Daddy react to that? And what's the reasoning for this idea of, stuff this for a game of soldiers? I'm going to join the army and not push a pen around.
Yeah, I think he just wanted an active life. So he attended the local Augustinian school, and at 13 he was apprenticed to a clerk of the chief notary of the town. He then moved on to work for the king's attorney. And at that stage, he wanted something more active. He asked his father to find him more active employment. It was dull, it was dreary, it did not enthuse him at the slightest. So he went off to work at the ironworks. It's a town I'm gonna completely mangle, for which I apologize. I think it's Appenweiler. Um, yeah, so even though he was still undertaking some office work, he actually learned a bit about the ironmongery and the working of the mines. And even that still wasn't active enough for him. So in 1788, he decided that his true calling was a military life and enlisted, as you say, as a hussar. But that was pre-revolution. So contrary to a lot of the marshals who joined up just as the revolution was opening doors, Ney's initial promotion was very, very slow.
And he we're going to talk about the sort of the impetuous nature of the guy. 1791, he's fighting a duel with a fencing master. Does he have a bit of a death wish, or is there actually a legitimate issue at stake here?
There was a legitimate issue. So rather than Ney going around and picking fights, as he does later on in his career. He had enlisted in the regiment that was affectionately nicknamed the Regiment of the Colonel General, and the arrival regiment of chasseurs, the Chasseurs de Ventimille, were quartered in the same region, and their fencing master had challenged the fencing master of Ney's regiment to a duel and had promptly beaten the man and actually wounded him quite badly. At which point the Chasseurs de Ventimille started to lord it over Ney's regiment, and there was a fair bit of crowing involved. And Ney's comrades decided something needed to be done. Somebody needed to teach him a lesson. And Ney had established a reputation as being pretty damn good with a sword, also pretty brave to boot. So he was nominated as the chosen man. The duel was all set to go when Ney's colonel intervened, reminded them that this was forbidden, and it was temporarily cancelled. But all that happens was, as soon as the colonel was suitably distracted, they just rearranged the duel and had it anyway. And
I
Ney
am
won.
shocked.
Yes, who'd have thought it? But Ney won. He defeated the fencing master, and according to Ney's English biographer Attridge, and I really hope this is true, but it does smack a little bit of urban legend. He had wounded the guy quite badly and left him unable to wield a sword, and obviously thus deprived him of his livelihood. And in the later years, when Ney had risen and was marshal and therefore in command of a decent fortune and had every sort of dignity he could wish, actually tracked down this old fencing master and made him comfortable financially for life. I really hope that's true, but I do think it sort of has a little bit of a ring of urban legend to it as well.
It does, doesn't it? But like you say, you just hope that that's true. That's the sort of thing that you want to be true of these people in history who go on to these heights, that they do have that sort of element of humility and that element of humanity, I guess.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's something, there's a common thread in Ney's life that's, again, I would compare him to Napoleon, that he seems to be this sort of very long list of contrasts, because he had kind of a volcanic temper, but could also be very kind and very humane, as he demonstrated when he helped two priests escape instead of sending them to their deaths during the revolution. And he was known that when emigres, when he recognized them, he would affect not to know who they were and would mix them up with foreign prisoners. He wasn't a bloodthirsty man in that sense, and he showed that again in the Peninsular War, where Major Napier, who was brother of the historian, became Ney's prisoner, and he treated him like an old friend, not with the sort of cold civility of an enemy who's given parole. He actually treated him incredibly well. So he could be a humane man, and he was an honest man by and large as well.
so revolution's obviously underway come 1791. How does he end up getting commissioned? And looking at the notes that you've very kindly sent me, he's at Valmy, which talk about sort of the first big turning point for the revolution, and the moment that, I mean, it shouldn't really have saved the revolution, but it does end up saving the revolution in a lot of respects. He's sort of in the thick of it, right?
Yeah, so that works out as Ney's first pitched battle, and it's just during that time he gets commissioned as a lieutenant. So just up to the sort of height of the revolution, he had risen through the ranks of non-commissioned officers. He'd risen as high as he could go. And it's interesting when you read some of his biographies, the testimonials that were given by his comrades. And he served as an ADC to General Lamarche at one point, who furnished him with a glowing testimonial that he was an excellent soldier, he was reliable, he had every zeal and courage, and had discharged his duties to the utmost excellence. He was very well thought of. He's interestingly never ventures to the Italian arena. He's always in the north. He's around the army of the Rhine, and of course has that association, therefore, in Napoleon's eyes, with Moreau. But he was incredibly successful. We could read through, the entire list that army was engaged in. But first pitched battle was in Valmy. He spent a month as an Austrian prisoner in 1797, then was released very quickly. He got a cavalry command under Bernadotte in the army of the Lower Rhine towards the late 1790s, where his bilingual abilities came in very handy. He was ordered to take Mannheim, and he went ahead to kind of reconnoitre and make a note of the defences. And of course, being bilingual, he could move about the city, make note of the defences, and he fell into conversation with a pregnant woman who told him that she had special permission to enter the city whenever her labour began. So Ney filed that piece of useful piece of information away. Ney returned to his men, selected 150 of them to accompany him, waited for nightfall, snuck in close to the city and waited for an opportunity. And the pregnant woman came to the drawbridge, which was lowered, and the gate was opened. Ney and his men charged inside and intimidated the local commander into surrendering, and therefore the fortress was taken without a siege because Ney could speak German and made conversation with a German lady.
Balls and brains. That's what I'm going to classify that as. Balls
Yes.
and brains. I mean, that's impressive going. And his promotion ends up being rapid as a result of it. I mean, 5 years, so 1792 through to 97, right? He's then general of division. What kind of sense do we get of him as a commander as he's rising? Because this is a guy who's clearly spent his time in the ranks, knows his trade very obviously, but at the same time, the thing that we always decry in the British Army is if you promote people too far too fast, actually they outstrip their capabilities. This is the problem that the Prince of Orange has. You know, he'd have been perfectly capable as a major at that particular point that at the age that he was at Waterloo, which I've got a feeling is something like 22. But to have him in command of a corps was just stupidity. So for Ney to make this very rapid rise, are there indications that he needs time to bed in, or does he just take to it like a duck to water?
No, at this stage in his career, he seizes the opportunity and distinguishes himself. He leads from the front. He amasses quite a lengthy list of wounds as well. He was wounded when Mannheim, when a cannonball killed his horse, wounded his leg. At another point in time, he was actually struck in the chest with a bullet and knocked clean over to the ground. But thankfully, the bullet's momentum was spent enough that he actually was very badly bruised and not killed. But up until the late 1790s, this is a glittering career. It's full of victories. It's full of daring action, and he sort of again accumulates the good opinion of a lot of his comrades. But he's never an intimate of Napoleon's.
Yeah, does he end up rubbing people up the wrong way at all over the course of this? Because, success always attracts a bit of ire from certain quarters. Does he start to kind of gather a collection of enemies, or at least people who are discontent with seeing him rise, where they feel that he shouldn't and they should instead?
At this stage, he's actually very sensible about things pre-Marshallate, when he sort of then has to jockey for position with a lot of very similar personalities. But at this stage, he very much keeps his head down. He's not involved in intrigue. He doesn't plunder, so he's not a looter. He has no intention of amassing a fortune by helping himself to things, which obviously keeps him in decent esteem with other people. He keeps his head well clear of politics. He's not involved in the Brumaire coup. He's not one of Napoleon's inner circle at this stage, so he's not jockeying for position around Napoleon either. So at this stage, he has a reputation of a successful, talented soldier, a patriot, a Republican, but somebody who's brought great credit to France.
How does he end up in Napoleon's sphere of influence then?
It's not until 1800 he takes command of the 1st Division in Saint-Cyr's Corps at the Rhine. And he is given again, distinguishes himself, carries out his orders very well, that Napoleon puts him as commander of the French army in Switzerland, because the Swiss are starting to rebel against French occupation, against the French ideals being sort of not forced on them as such, but diplomatically suggested to them. And Napoleon sends Ney in. But it's interesting that this is where you also see Ney's sort of headstrong nature rears its head as well, because he sends Napoleon a summary of the situation and decides, I need to act. I'm therefore going to do X, Y, Z. But he doesn't wait for Napoleon's approval to take action, and he jumps in with both feet. Now, ultimately, it works out, but that pattern starts to replicate throughout his life, and it doesn't always work out when he sort of leaps without looking.
How does Napoleon feel about that and handle that? Because it's very much a case of how the cards fall as to whether that's okay or whether that's the stupidest thing known to man. And we see this a great deal in the flack that he gets for Waterloo, the flack that I certainly give him for the Coa, where Ney does what I called a Ney. People turn around and say, well, on other occasions, Ney doing a Ney leads to X victory. And you go, well, yeah, great, but sometimes it's just dumb. And that's a problem for somebody like Napoleon, who sort of likes that element of control, right?
Yeah. Well, I thought it was interesting in your video of the cause, you said he sort of snatched defeat from the jaws of a victory.
Yeah.
And that is essentially kind of what happens if you look at some of the occasions where he is erratic. And this is what sort of sometimes frustrates me when people go, oh, who could have guessed that Ney would have done that at Waterloo? That's what
Like
Ney does
everybody.
throughout his life. Now, sometimes it pays off. It worked in Switzerland. And although, Ney had never been a big, an intimate or a bosom friend of Napoleon, he wasn't integral to Brumaire or anything like that. Post Brumaire, Napoleon makes him Inspector General of Cavalry. He's pleased with how things go in Switzerland. But of course, there's plenty of other occasions. He jumps the gun at Jena. He prolongs the winter campaigning before Friedland, where Ney's sort of inability to do what other people need him to do doesn't always work out. Now, in a lot of cases, he redeems himself in really spectacular fashion, but as we've discussed before about Waterloo, after Waterloo, there is no redemption. So it's good to have dash, and it's good to have ambition, and there's nobody, unless they're a complete numpty, is going to sit and argue that Ney wasn't one of the most brave individuals of that era.
Without question.
But sometimes cooler heads prevail.
Yeah. I mean, it comes back to that similar kind of discussion that we had about Murat, isn't it? Except that Murat is sort of perhaps a bit more about personal bravery, where Ney is brave, but is using that bravery for me in a very sort of specific context. You could actually make a similar point about Murat, in fairness. He's sort of trying to make a point and inspire, particularly when he jumps on his horse and sort of charges the whole regiment with merely his entourage. But that's just dumb. And I think for me, it's that lack of inclination to stop and consider the position. There's no sort of, well, you kind of looked, you said it yourself. There's no look before you leap. It's sort of all in, and then, oh, this isn't working. Well, and this is particularly, apologies, folks, we have leapt forward to the Coa here, in what sort of informing some of what I'm saying, but that sense of, okay, this isn't working. I've got a very narrow bridge in front of me. I've sent across a very high quality unit. They've all died or run away. I'm just going to send more men in. There's none of that sort of stopping for. There's no obvious indication of stopping for a moment and just considering, is this smart? That sort of sense of reinforcing failure, which I think for me is a problem. And that then you can draw a direct line some would say, to what happens at Waterloo,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
You
yeah.
know, the first wave doesn't do anything, so let's send in more without
More.
sufficient support. Yes, okay, before people start shouting at me, yes, there's some artillery support, yes, there's a bit of infantry support. It all arrives far too little, far too late. Um, for me, that's the problem with him.
Yes.
Um,
And if you'll excuse me making a really stupid popular culture comparison, but
oh,
you
do
know in
it,
that
please.
episode of Blackadder Goes Forth, where they're trying to work out the next plan and they want to send Blackadder and Co up to sort of make artistic depictions of the defences. And Blackadder guesses the plan, and Darling said, "How could you possibly know that, Blackadder? It's classified information." And he said, "It's the same plan we used last time, sir, and the 17 times before that." And they can't understand why the enemy, Melchett and Darling can't understand why the enemy is going to see that this is going to happen. And it's a stupid comparison in the sense that it's farce. But again, a good general sometimes needs to learn from mistakes, and Ney could be quite excitable. And I have a real fondness for Ney before everybody thinks I'm, turning this into a let's bash Ney. He had real strengths and he had a real sort of strength of character in a lot of ways. But you need to be able to adapt and learn and avoid repeating failure. And as you've just established, if you see something's gone wrong, throwing more men at it doesn't sort of put you in this top strategic tier. Because if you look at a lot of the rankings when people discuss the marshals, and I can never come up with a definitive ranking because I change my mind every time, but Ney always is up there in the top five. For most people, they'll say, oh, Davout, Lan, Suchet, depends if we're counting Berthier as a fighting, marshal or not. Soult, some people vote for Murat, but usually Ney's there. But I don't think you can put in all fairness, I don't think you can put Ney and Murat for the exact reason we've just specified alongside Lan and Davout and Massena. Massena's decline notwithstanding, because there isn't that same strategic insight where it's just, let's charge all the things until they go away. And again, I'm being a bit facetious, but he needed that strategic insight to couple with the bravery and the inspirational conduct.
Yeah, I think that's really fairly put. I mean, it's not like the guy can't do great things. And he's got that ability to strike and identify the weak points. Look at what happens leading up to the Koa. He
Mm-hmm.
absolutely hands Crawford's backside on a plate to him. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's it's great. It's exactly what he identifies as opportunity, sends in the cavalry round the open flank in between the left flank of the light division's position and the fortress of Almeida. Runs a bit of a risk, but kind of figures what he can loop round behind before they've really managed to bring the guns to bear. And it's remarkable. It's really good. And then he manages to go and incur far more losses just because of this episode with the bridge that he attacks 3 times. And you sort of go, oh, come on, come on. Yeah, I share a lot of what you've said there. I like fundamentally Ney, but there are moments when I sort of go, no, but that's not smart.
Mm-hmm.
And I I wonder if I'm more inclined to be generous with some of his failings because it's Ney and because there's no denying that my God was the guy brave and he absolutely put his money where his mouth was. Um, I don't know. Yeah.
I think I agree with you. I probably am fairer to Ney than I am to Murat. And I acknowledge that a lot of that's just from personal bias because I like Ney's character more. I think a lot of Ney's decisions were less about personal vanity necessarily than Murat, and Murat's supporters might think I'm being unfair there. That's not saying Ney didn't have an ego because my God was the man touchy and quarrelsome, as we'll come to.
He was a
Uh,
Marshal of France. They all had a bloody
Sort of
ego the size
goes with
of.
the title, doesn't it? But yeah, I don't know. I think I probably cut Ney a lot more slack than I do cut Murat. Probably in all fairness, just because I like him better.
So we've talked about all of these good. We're going to rewind again, folks. We're going to we'll
We're
probably
meandering a
get,
bit.
yeah, we are. We'll get back to Spain. But I sort of jumped ahead, and we were kind of talking about that period of considerable success in the 1790s. He's very useful to Napoleon when it comes to the operation in Switzerland, but he, I mean, as rewards go, nearly going to the West Indies doesn't sort of seem like a particularly generous reward, considering what we know about the West Indies and how they are a graveyard for Western armies during this period.
Well, that wasn't a reward. That was at Ney's request. Yeah, he was made Inspector General of Cavalry in 1801, and in a sort of repeat of his younger years, wasn't really excited by the role. Carried out his duties, but realistically was longing for something a little bit more exciting, a bit more active. And the perception was that the San Domingo, as they called it, campaign was going to be a quick and an easy victory, and there were going to be rich rewards for the reaping. So Ney wrote to the Minister of War in the December of that year and asked to go there in command of the cavalry. On the 18th of December, Napoleon signed off that appointment, showing that he obviously had some degree of confidence in Ney's abilities because, that's a fairly important role. But on the 19th, just the day after that appointment was signed, Ney actually got back in touch and said, could we delay that until January, please? Family matters mean it might be more important that I stay in France. And on New Year's Day, he decided actually he would stick with the Inspector General of Cavalry role. So it was really only by Josephine's very timely matchmaking in trying to find a husband for her daughter's friend that Ney didn't wind up in the West Indies, where it's entirely possible that would have been the end of him, and it wouldn't have been the sort of big, dramatic, noble slash, tragic end that people talk about now.
You raised Josephine, who has become one of my favorite topics of conversation in recent months since that Napoleon trailer came out. And um, everybody knows my excitement about the portrayal of Josephine there because I think it's far closer to what we've discussed. And I'm therefore full of hope. So there's a Josephine story in here. I'm going to grab it with both hands. Talk us through her involvement here and also talk us through the marriage. What's Ney like as a husband? Because some of the marshals don't make particularly good husbands, others absolutely do. Oudinot, I think we can probably class as one of the good guys out of this story. We won't go back into the conversation about Murat's marriage because I mean, boy, was that a boy, was that a story in itself. What's it like for Ney though?
Yeah, Ney very firmly belongs in the latter category of good husbands, and he is a sort of chosen bridegroom by Josephine, who is looking to get her daughter's friend settled. So Hortense had been a school fellow of Aglaé Ogi. I'm probably not pronouncing that surname correctly, and I have looked it up, but I can't find guidance on that one. She was the daughter of a lady in waiting to Marie Antoinette, who had been so overcome when the Queen was arrested and condemned to die that she had eventually taken her own life. And Aglaé's father was imprisoned, though he was later released. But her aunt was Madame de Campan, who educated her nieces at the same place as was educated Hortense and Caroline Bonaparte. So Hortense and Aglaé were good friends, and Josephine took an interest in this young woman and was very keen to see her well settled, was keen to find her an appropriate and dashing, suitable husband who would treat her well. And Ney was the chosen man, and she put the wheels at work. The first meeting didn't go off particularly well. Ney still wore his hair in the style of a hussar, so he still kept the queue and he had the side whiskers, which wasn't particularly fashionable at that point in time. So Aglaé didn't have the best first impression, and then Ney was a bit worried that she seemed quite cold, but Josephine was very keen to see this come off, and she sort of persuaded Aglaé to give him a chance and told him all the various good things she knew about Ney and all the good things she had heard. Ney scrapped the queue, scrapped the facial hair, thereafter was clean shaven, and things progressed a lot more happily from that point on, and they were married on the 5th of August 1802.
That's quite a lengthy courtship, isn't it? Have I got my dates wrong there?
Yeah, no, there was a little bit of to and fro-ing. Yeah, so Ney met his future wife at New Year of 1802. So Josephine had basically indicated that she was setting him up over that period, and that's when he sort of indicated that it would be preferable for him to stay in France, which was, as we've said, a good thing that he did. So he got as far as the month of May. Matters had so advanced that he thought he might venture on a formal proposal. And it was made, sorry, I beg your pardon, to Aglaé's father, not from her uncle. And this, I'll just quote, this is from Atridge, Josephine's letter to Ney. I send you, General, the letter you have asked of me for Citizen Ogwyd. I beg that you will read it. I have not said in it all the good things that I know and think about you. I want to let this worthy family have the satisfaction of discovering for themselves all your good qualities. But I repeat to you the assurance of the interest which Bonaparte and I myself take in this marriage, and of the satisfaction he feels in thinking that he will thus secure the happiness of two people for whom he has special goodwill and esteem. I share with him both these feelings. So Josephine, was really keen to see Ney well settled.
That's a very nice letter. Is Josephine normally that pleasant in letters?
I think Josephine doesn't get nearly enough credit than she deserves, actually, because she, gets sort of stereotyped and slandered as this sort of catty, hysterical nymphomaniac, and that's not really who she was. And when she cared about someone, she would genuinely do her utmost to help them in any way that she could. And for the future Madame Ney, she absolutely was a real bastion of her interests.
While we're talking about Josephine, because it's topical, what was your take on the Napoleon trailer and the portrayal of Josephine?
Mixed. I quite like it in the sense that I like that when she was at the ball and they showed her with the shorn hair and the red ribbon around her neck. I read a really good set of historical fiction novels a few years ago now, and it's called The Secret Lives and Diaries of Josephine B. And it's supposed to be Josephine's diaries throughout her life. And I actually remembered at the time the way that was described, that they were celebrating, and it was almost a sort of like thumb in their nose at the guillotine. They had got through it, and so I sort of like that was brought into it. It is bugging me, the age difference. I would have zero concerns with the actress if they cast Napoleon younger, but it's bugging me that she being 6 years older than him really affected the dynamic of their relationship, because Napoleon was completely sexually inexperienced, Josephine wasn't, and that was a fundamental part of their dynamic. And to have a 45-year-old man play Napoleon, and I'm not sure how old the actress is. Her name's gone right out of my head.
Vanessa Kirby.
Yeah, she played
I've been
Princess
corrected
Margaret
on this many times, because initially I very stupidly in my reaction video said it was Jodie Comer, who obviously was originally
slotted. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think Vanessa Kirby's a cracking actress, and she does a great job in The Crown, and she did a great job in Mission Impossible. But if the age bracket, I'm not going to lie, is bugging me. But that's more of my sort of quibbles with Joaquin Phoenix, who, again, fantastic actor, but I don't know, something in the trailer wasn't giving me magnetic charisma in the way that we know Napoleon was. He sort of, I don't know, was a bit mumbly. But
yeah, aloof was.
I hope I'm going to be proven wrong.
Yeah, aloof was certainly my feeling. I just loved that because it struck me very strongly what you said in the Marshal's Wives episode, that we love to apply this double standard when it comes to Josephine. In fact, I'm going to do a video reacting to people sort of going, oh, Napoleon was a cuckold because Josephine was sleeping around, and make this point that you made so brilliantly that hello, Napoleon, what, didn't sleep around? And that's something that we just ignore. But what we got from this trailer for me was this kind of the bite back from Josephine. Josephine as a ballsy character in her own way, in her own right, who wouldn't take things lying down. And I'm hoping that I haven't just seen what I want to see in that, because that has occurred to me. The more that people talk about this, the more I have kind of looked at it and gone, yeah, there are quite a few historical inaccuracies in what's portrayed, and I'm just hoping that I haven't seized on what I'm hoping to see, and that's kind of eclipsed everything else. But interesting. We shall see, I guess.
Yeah.
So Marshal's list, 1804. Where is he on
12th.
the list? He's 12th. Okay. And
So
apologies, you'll have to remind me. 12 out of how many?
The 14, and then there's the 4 honorary appointments.
Okay.
So off the top of my head, I don't have the list to hand. I think the only 2 that come after him are Bessières and Davout.
Davout below Ney on the list of marshals. There's an interesting one.
That's one of those big what ifs. We're talking about going to the West Indies, because if Leclerc hadn't gone to the West Indies, realistically, there's every chance that baton would have been his and not Davout's. I mean, Davout really, at that point, hadn't made his name as the great man that we would know him to be, or the great general that he'd be known to be. He got, well, the expectation is that he got it because he was Napoleon's brother-in-law's brother-in-law, and he also benefited by being Desaix's friend. So had Desaix survived, had Leclerc survived, I think it's highly likely we'd have had no Marshal Davout, and what a big what if that would have been.
Yes, what would have happened with the Jena Aristata affair then?
Sorry, neighbour, stealing your thunder, but yes.
Yeah. Okay, so that's where he is on the list of marshals. We touched on this earlier. The marshals are a prickly bunch, to put it mildly. So for a guy who's managed to not overly rub people up the wrong way up until now, is it just that he's surrounded by a bunch of prickly, egotistical, narcissistic people, and they're all vying for position, or is there something unique? Do we see him forming certain bonds with certain characters and then actually taking issue with others?
Some of his subordinates he sort of held himself quite aloof as a commander. He didn't necessarily consult with other people very often. But I mean, even up until Spain, there's nothing, there's no huge carries on. There's not a huge amount of arguing. But I think Ney, as we say, the marshals were all very much alike. When Napoleon was calling the shots and Napoleon was dishing out the rewards, they were all, by and large, at their best. You can sort of section off Davout, Lannes, and Massena as having genuine, real talent for independent command. I mean, if you left Massena on his own, he would have stolen everything, but he did have talent for independent command. Whereas all the rest of the marshals were at their best when it was Napoleon who was in charge. And you see that sort of in the early years of the Empire. Ney's, he's present at all the big battles of the era. He's at Austerlitz, he's at Ulm. He jumps the gun at Jena, though. He's there. He, gets quite eager to attack and takes action before he's supposed to. And that could have gone quite badly, but, he's managed to be sort of extracted by some of the other marshals, and he's reprimanded by Napoleon. But of course, he then goes on to take part in the pursuit of the defeated forces and, redeems himself spectacularly. He takes thousands of prisoners, he captures various guns. So he gets himself very firmly back into Napoleon's good books. I've totally just brushed over his great victory at Elchingen, from which he gets his ducal title. Um,
We should just say, folks, yes, obviously we haven't deep dived into every single thing that Ney does over the course of his lifetime for one very good reason. We've got lives beyond this podcast. So we could sit here and you could do a whole series on Ney, but time is not our
yeah.
friend. So don't start coming at us about the fact that, oh, we didn't talk about X, Y, and Z, because there's a vast amount that we could have talked about for all of these people. But
Yeah.
sometimes you just need to move on for the sake of decent podcasting. But apologies, I cut you off there.
No, no, exactly. These are just summaries of the Marshals' lives. These were very eventful, very dramatic, very colourful lives. This is only intended to be a bit of a summary. I am in no means a proper historian. I'm just talking about elements of the Marshals that are interesting. There are loads of excellent biographies and works on the Marshals to go and read if you're looking for, battlefield blow by blows. Um, but yeah, it's Spain where Ney goes, and he does not play nicely with others. That's when the argumentative nature really rears its head, and he clashes basically with everybody.
He does. I feel like most of them clash with one another because you've almost got too many marshals out there, haven't you? That's this is the great irony for me of the Peninsular War, and everybody goes, "Oh, Wellington, well, clearly he wasn't Napoleon's equal." And actually, you know what? I would actually just about agree with that assessment. I won't revisit the reasons why. Go listen to other episodes where I've laboured that point before. But when it comes to most of Napoleon's really good commanders, the people um, that everybody rates, they all end up being humbled by Wellington. But part of the issue is that in itself points to the problem that you've got a lot of Napoleon's really good commanders out there, and
Mhm.
they're all wanting a command.
Yeah, they'd been used to taking orders from Napoleon. Suddenly, they're all effectively turned loose in Spain. Napoleon, it's a completely different avenue of war. Um, they're not used to civilian uprisings all over the place. They've been fighting armed troops against armed troops, and
That's a good
civilians have
point.
been a completely neutral, bystanders. But for the most part, it's a completely different avenue of war, topographically, culturally, in terms of their supplies, just completely different. They're not taking orders directly from Napoleon, but Napoleon's, sending out the orders anyway without fully appreciating the circumstances. Joseph is king of Spain,
Oh,
supposedly,
don't get me started on Joseph.
and poor flipping Jourdan's been assigned to be Joseph's, you know, major general in Spain. None of the other marshals listen to a word he says. They basically treat him with complete contempt. I mean, well, I've got a sort of bookmark in my atridge here, but I mean, Ney is unbelievably rude to Jourdan. And he sends a letter to, upon receiving a plan of campaign from Jourdan, sends back, this order is drawn up by someone who knows nothing of our business. The Emperor has given me an army to conquer with and not to capitulate. You may tell the king, i.e., King Joseph, that I have not come here to play the part of Dupont.
Oh my God.
So, and to be fair to Ney, he is not the only one who treats Jourdan with contempt. He is just blatantly ignored all over the place. Victor ignores him, Soult ignores him. They just treat him abysmally.
See, that doesn't surprise me too much with Victor. Saul, we'll get to Saul another day, I think. Um, Complicated, but that's so damn rude. I mean, can you imagine if it's spoken to, I don't know, Murat like that? What the consequences would have been? That wouldn't have ended well.
Well, then
Um,
at one point he nearly fights a duel with Soult. Um, who is at one point left, obviously, without, after retreating, left without baggage and artillery, etc. And he starts sort of making demands of what he needs Ney to do. Ney's hackles go straight up, and at one point, the two of them are standing, effectively nose to nose, hands on swords, and their staff officers have to intervene and stop them from fighting each other.
Is that 1809? So post Porto,
Mm-hmm.
that's happening. Okay, that's interesting.
It depends on the source you read as well. I mean, the Chandler chapter, you'll probably remember reading it, says, "Oh, we refuse to give Soult even a gun," whereas Ashridge is a much more flattering biography. And I acknowledge as well, yes, I am reading English sources. I'm afraid my French is not that good that I have time to go through French sources quickly. But he does give Soult some artillery teams, but it's a fractious relationship. And again, because they both want, the glory, they both want to make their names. And that's before we even throw Massena into the mix, when Ney becomes attached to the army of Portugal, because that is a relationship that goes south extremely quickly.
Doesn't it just? Do we want to dwell on why? Why is that so bad? And why does it fall apart so catastrophically?
I think Ney, in one way, just had lost respect for Massena. We'll cover this obviously when we do the Massena episode. Massena was in his 50s at this point, and he had amassed / stolen an enormous fortune. He lived very comfortably, and as far as he was concerned, he'd been at war pretty much most of his life. He had earned a comfortable retirement, and it was Napoleon who twisted his arm and insisted that the darling child of victory go to Spain. And Massena did not want to be there. And other subordinates, it wasn't just Ney, remarked that he was not the Massena of Italy or Zurich or Rivoli. But he also brought his mistress with him on campaign. Sources differ as to her name, whether it was Eugenie or Henriette, but allegedly dressed in the uniform, of a dragoon, and he was more concerned with what he was getting up to with her rather than, the actual campaign itself. And on one occasion, when he'd invited his officers to dine with him, expected Ney to escort the lady to the table, and Ney was just apoplectic with rage at being asked to entertain Massena's mistress. And he was so rude to her that she either genuinely fainted or had the good sense to pretend to faint so she could get out of the awful atmosphere. But that didn't help matters. And then, of course, as Ney was making preparations to besiege Ciudad Rodrigo, Massena sends a young engineer of Junot's to Ney with the instruction that he would take over preparations for the siege. And that's when Ney writes the most incredibly rude letter to Massena that I cannot believe he kept his position after that.
Do you have a quote to hand? Because I feel that we need to hear this.
I do. So Massena had sent over this Lieutenant Colonel Velazzi initially. He was a protege of Junot's, and he was an engineer. He came with the letter, orders from Massena. Ney sent him straight back saying, "You can tell Junot to keep his proteges. If they're so good, let him keep him himself." Massena sent the poor guy back again with orders, at which point this is the letter. "Monsieur le Marshal, I am a duke and a marshal of the empire like you. As for your title of Prince of Esseling, it is of no importance outside the Tuileries. You tell me that you're commander-in-chief of the army of Portugal. I know it only too well. So when you tell Michel Ney to lead his troops against the enemy, you'll see how he will obey you. But when it pleases you to disarrange the staff of the army appointed by the Prince of Neuchâtel, Berthier, you must understand that I will no more listen to your orders than I fear your threats. See here, just ask the Duke d'Abrantes, that's Junot, what he and I did a few weeks ago when we received from that other, who is Major General to the King, Jourdan, orders differing from those that came to us from Paris, and were therefore orders from the Emperor. Do you know what we did? We obeyed the orders from Paris. We did right, for they praised us and praised us warmly. I'd letters from Madrid in which I was called, I believe, a rebel. And that is about as absurd as calling me a poltroon. I took no notice of it, and General Junot would certainly have acted the same way. Adieu, Monsieur le Marshal, I esteem you, and you know it. You esteem me, and I know it. But why the devil so discord between us over a mere caprice? For after all, how on earth are you to know that your little man can throw a bomb better than my old veteran, who is, I assure you, a reliable fellow? They say your man dances prettily, all the better for him, but that does not prove that he can make those mad Spaniards dance, and that is what we want. I remain, Monsieur le Marshal, etc., Ney.
Wow. Oh, to have
Can you
been a fly on the
imagine
wall.
being Messina receiving that letter?
It's remarkable that Ney kept his head, quite
Yeah, I
frankly.
mean, eventually he was, as we know, relieved of his command by Messina, because it got to the point he wouldn't obey orders unless he knew they'd been sort of countersigned by Napoleon. And it got to the stage there was literally nothing Messina could do for him. And I think Ney was quite glad to get out of Portugal. But whether he stayed quite glad when he saw what followed, I don't know.
Well, out of the frying pan into the fire, right? And it is a frying pan, that third invasion of Portugal. There's no question about it. Sure, he plays his part, Koa, the good and the bad of that action there, but then also Basako, his he has one of the two wings and forms the principal part of the attack on the Allied left flank. And you look at the ground and think, how the bloody hell did anybody expect anyone to climb up that without their arms and ammunition, let alone with them and with pack? But that's an episode for another day. So he plays his part. He's also obviously key during the retreat. But then, having done all of that, and it was a horrendous campaign, he then ends up in Russia,
Yeah, it's almost
which
like
is
Portugal, the retreat there is almost like a dress rehearsal.
exactly what I'm kind of leaning towards here. Is there a sense actually that that experience is useful to him, or is this just what Ney is born for?
I think a bit of both. He obviously benefits from the experience, but when again we can look at the various marshals and we can pinpoint their strengths, their weaknesses, and Ney seems to rise to his absolute best almost when the situation's impossible. When he doesn't have to make, strategic decisions, he doesn't have to cooperate particularly with rivals. When he is needed to sort of lead a rear guard, there was nobody finer.
Is it that sense of sort of strike back, hold the line for a bit? That's when he is at his best. Am I oversimplifying things? Obviously, there are times when Ney can go on the attack and all the rest of it. Nobody's pretending that's not the case. But actually, is his very specific strength on those occasions when you need to buy time, or you just need to fight, and you need to fight like an absolute bloody devil in order to achieve a very limited goal. And he doesn't need to sort of think about that bigger picture. And so getting aggressive is actually what's really needed. And that's when he comes to the fore. Is that fair, would you say?
Yeah, he can stand and hold, he can inspire other people to stand beside him. I mean, the numerous instances where people were fleeing and he managed to sort of rally, not all of them, but rally enough to hold that line enough to keep the rear guard going.
Let's talk about the bravest of the brave line and where that comes from. Obviously, folks, you know the history. Well, maybe you don't know the history of the invasion of Russia. I will cover that with Alex Mikabridze in granular detail in due course. This is why you want to stay subscribed to the Patreon. Hashtag shameless plug.
Right.
But there comes a point, right, where Ney gets cut off, and for all intents and purposes, he cuts his way out.
Right? Yeah. They initially think he's lost. He's been cut off from Davout and from Eugene, and Napoleon initially thinks he's lost Ney, and he talks about having, I have 3 million francs in the Tuileries and I'd give it all up to get Ney back. And by sheer bloody-minded stubbornness, Ney fights his way back. I mean, there are accounts of him, picking up discarded muskets that have been thrown down by, retreating troops, and he keeps fighting. At one point, he's effectively almost surrounded. He's called on to surrender, and he's a Marshal of France can never surrender, and I won't parley under the fire of the enemy. And at one point, when an envoy sent to him and the Russians keep firing on him, he tells the very surprised envoy, well, your troops have fired on you, therefore rendering your white flag useless. You're my prisoner now, monsieur. And for 3 weeks, that envoy shares the privations of Ney's corps. Well, what's left of it? I mean, he's left with, at the end, 300 men of 35,000. But his stamina and his ability to keep going is just almost superhuman. I mean, Borodino would have been a complete disaster without Ney. He holds out. He manages to get his men over the Dnieper. Again, what little is left of them. One of his staff officers falls in. It's Ney who crawls along the frozen ice to physically haul the man out himself. He just takes on, and again, as you say, I'm conscious we've been speaking for an hour and a quarter already without going into too much detail of every battle in Russia. He just keeps going. His ability to just find more strength and to keep people fighting. And again, the story of when he at Kovno comes across an artillery piece that's been abandoned, and the one remaining commanding officer is struck by a cannonball, realizes he's been mortally wounded, draws his pistol and shoots himself in the head. People start chucking down their muskets and running all over the place. Ney picks up the muskets one after the other, after the other, after the other, and just fires them. And he makes the Russians fight him every single step of the way out of Russia. And of course, according to popular legend, he's the last man on Russian soil.
Indeed, it's almost like the guy doesn't know when to quit.
He doesn't. And that kind of keeps his men from completely losing their heads and running. He hangs on to some sort of semblance of fighting spirit.
And where for me this differs from Murat, and I am conscious that we have been talking for a while, and we do probably need to start moving towards the final chapter, as it were. Where this differs for me from Murat is, I get the feeling he doesn't fight for himself. He doesn't fight to prove a point. It's, we have got to keep fighting. Otherwise, we're either going to get stabbed with a lance, or we're going to get captured and wind up in a POW camp somewhere. And I get the feeling that he uses himself as an example to keep men fighting in order for the majority to survive. That's my sense of it. Now you could turn around and say, well, actually, isn't the smart move to just surrender at this point? But that's not in Ney's nature. You require Ney to not,
as
be
we
Ney.
see. Yeah.
I don't think it's possible to dabble even in the story of Ney during the Russian campaign and not come away with a fundamental respect for the cojones on the guy, right? That's what we're talking about here. So let's fast forward to the abdication at this point, because I've got an eye on the time, and you do need to get back to life. We could talk about the marshals all week, but
I'm just thinking for length of the episode. But yeah, so Ney is one of the driving forces of he sort of leads the Marshals' rebellion, as it were, against Napoleon. And it's clear post-Russia that he's not lost the appetite for war. He still distinguishes himself. He still performs admirably. But his conviction, his confidence in Napoleon is waning. And he says, it would be better to have peace. And he's thinking of France, not just about his own comfort in his own life, but he is thinking about what's best for France. And France is exhausted. The sheer number of men that had been lost in Russia is, it sort of beggars belief. And so when he arrived to sort of confront Napoleon, he is joined by Marshals Lefebvre and Moncey, and they sort of lead a sort of um, discussion amongst their comrades, and they decide something has to be done. Somebody's got to be the spokesperson, and that's not really a particularly attractive role to march in and tell Napoleon the game's up, it's lost, it's done. But Ney, he's not afraid of taking risks. I don't think Ney was really afraid of anything, in all honesty. And Ney volunteers himself as a spokesperson and goes with Lefebvre and Moncey to say to Napoleon, all that's left is abdication now. And Napoleon initially resists the idea. He is determined that he's going to bring the allies to battle. He still thinks he can snatch victory out of this. And Ney's, really quite blunt. It's a pity that peace was not made. The sooner there is nothing for it by abdication. And Napoleon keeps trying to talk people back around. That was Napoleon's strength. He could convince people, but it's fallen on deaf ears. Even Berthier sits in complete silence. He is not getting any support. And things get worse because MacDonald and Oudinot turn up to explain the state of their corps, and Napoleon tries to get them on side. And MacDonald says to Napoleon, I declare to you that we will not expose Paris to the fate of Moscow. We've taken our decision and we're resolved to make an end of all of this. And Napoleon starts to kind of lose his temper and says that the army will obey me. And it's Ney who says, sire, the army will obey its generals. And that's the statement that seems to finally make it register with Napoleon that ultimately his epic is at its end. And he signs the instrument of abdication. So Ney was a real linchpin in the abdication and in convincing Napoleon finally that he needed to give up.
It's an incredible scene. It really is. God, the temptation to dwell, quite frankly, but it's high drama. But also it gives you that indication of what is it that makes Ney tick. And there are points when he thinks a certain decision does and doesn't need to be made. And for him in that moment, that was the right decision. Yeah. And it's interesting that you don't have for Ney I'm going to mispronounce it, the ignominy, something like that.
Yeah,
you know what I'm trying to get at. Yeah. The stain of leading a fundamentally a revolt. That doesn't taint him.
No, I think Ney's focused on what is best for France. As are quite a lot of the marshals at that point. I think Lefebvre, Moncey, Oudinot, MacDonald, they are caring about what's best for France. I mean, even Davout, the most Bonapartist of all the marshals, obviously doesn't believe Napoleon had abdicated, but by the time it comes to the second abdication, is also focused on it needs to be what's best for France. Not them personally, not Napoleon personally. They are patriots. They care about their country.
We've talked a lot about Waterloo in various contexts, most recently, of course, for the Napoleonic and Revolutionary War Graves charities Waterloo Live. So I won't go into great depth about Waterloo other than to just query the thing that will lead us on to the final point. The big decision, the fabled, maybe apocryphal, I'll bring him back in an iron cage, and then doesn't just fail to do that, but jumps ship again. Do we have an indication of where his head is at? That he goes from such a strong melodramatic comment that as much as anything else would surely sign somebody's death warrant, to then siding with Napoleon. Is there an obvious indication of why?
His conduct's noted as being very excitable at this point in his life. Contemporaries say he was quite mercurial. He could, at one point he was in a tirade against Napoleon, but then he would also talk about the Bourbons. It rankled with him that his wife had been sneered at by the returning blue bloods, and that she'd been treated contemptuously, and also that he and the rest of the Bonapartist nobility were sneered at, because as far as Ney was concerned, they'd sat on their behinds in exile, where he and the other marshals, regardless of how much he quarrelled with them, had been spilling their blood for France. So at one point he found out that the Comte d'Artois had blundered at Lyon, and went off in a rant that the Comte d'Artois was too fine a gentleman to ever think of sharing a carriage with a Marshal of France. He's now leaving me without troops, without orders. But then he would rant about Napoleon. He's a madman. He would never forgive me his abdication. He'd be quite capable of cutting my head off. I can count on my men. The first soldier that moves to join him will have my sword through his body. But then he realised that actually his soldiers were by and large for Napoleon. And he would later say he sort of got swept up in the tide. But he also received a letter from Napoleon that told him, I'll receive you just as I did after Moscow. And you do wonder if there's a sense of Ney's a man who, he wasn't a politician, he wasn't one for, big flowery speeches or diplomacy. He had been sneered at by the Bourbons. The grass wasn't completely greener. Yes, France was at peace, but he was then having to stand shoulder to shoulder with people who had not put their lives on the line in the service of their country, who could effectively buy a legion of honour, who would hold themselves up as his superior by virtue of just coming out of the right womb. And suddenly here is Napoleon, who is giving him his due and falls back under Napoleon's spell. So how much is just pure mercurial getting caught up in the tide, and how much it is being sickened by the return of the aristocratic privileges, I don't know.
Having made his bed, though, boy, does he lie on it.
Yeah, it's a poison chalice and no mistake.
Yeah. The epitome of nailing your colours to the mast is Ney during this period. Again, we spoke about this, didn't we, for the Waterloo live stream. Folks, you'll have to trawl your way through it, because I haven't yet got round to releasing the individual interviews. I would guess that it's somewhere like 6 to 8 hours in. I know that's a big kind of time frame, but it would be around the kind of time of Ney's cavalry charges. So you'll have to go and search for it.
The equivalent, I think, of 3:45 and 4:30, I think. So if you can work out the start time,
yeah,
you'll be able to work out roughly when.
There you go, folks. Go hunting. It's a great interview, but there's no sense in treading over the same ground that we've talked about before.
Yeah.
But I do want to talk about trial and death, because he has so many opportunities, but sort of seems intent on, I don't know if it's pride, I don't know if it's principle, I don't know if it's stubbornness. It goes back to what I said at the start. It's perhaps it's a mixture of all of them.
And I think a degree of naivety.
Okay. I'm just going to let you talk on this, because you do this so well that this is the one thing I do want to repeat from that interview.
Yeah, he comes back to Paris. Napoleon is, of course, in the means, or going through the process of the second abdication. And I think in some way, shape and form, he thinks he is going to be protected by the treaty that Davout negotiates with the Allies. And Davout is adamant on the inclusion of Article 12, which is that nobody will be prescribed or prosecuted for their conduct during the 100 days. And Davout says at Ney's trial, if this had not been included in the treaty, he wouldn't have signed, he'd have given battle. But the Allies signed the treaty, and I think Ney imagines that he might get the protection. He certainly claims that he imagined he would have the protection of the treaty. He is offered, he goes to see Fouché and sort of tries to justify himself, but again, he sort of rambles and goes on tirades, and he is sort of almost manic in some the way he talks at some point. But Fouché gives him two passports, one for Marshal Ney and one as an alias, a tradesman, with a view that he could steal away, he could escape. He is given letters of introduction for New Orleans by a friend to go to America, as we know that Grouchy does. Soult goes off to exile elsewhere, but Ney and Grouchy are prescribed in Article 1. So they are, when Louis comes back, they are viewed as the most treasonous. But he doesn't go. His wife sort of pleads with him. And at one point, in one of his angrier moods, he says, "Well, my word, madam, you're in a great hurry to be rid of me." And she's doing her utmost to try and save him. When he eventually is arrested, he sort of dallies. He's not sure if he's going to go. He's not sure if he's going to stay. Is he technically in hiding or not? He eventually is arrested. And Exelman comes across him while he's actually being taken back to Paris and offers to help him escape. And again, he turns it down. Yeah, he just refuses any mechanism to help him escape. And then, of course, he's offered a military court-martial. And Davout sort of almost pleads with him, take the military court-martial. And Ney refuses. He wants trial by peer. And he also seems to be convinced that being filled with some of his rivals or enemies, Massena being one, Jourdan, who he's also thumbed his nose at, that they're going to condemn him. And he sort of insists on that's not the mechanism he wants to go down. He talks to his lawyer when he finally gets out of it. Those fellows would have shot me like a rabbit. Well, realistically, that was his best chance at exoneration. So he insists on trial. And again, he, bursts out in the courtroom. His lawyer tries to plead the technicality of his birth in Tsar Louis, now meaning he's a Prussian citizen. Ney's not having it. He's French, and he will remain French. And it comes to the point when the peers are asked to vote, and they get, after he's found guilty, they get two votes. Essentially to see if they may want to be more merciful on the second vote. He's still overwhelmingly, the votes are overwhelmingly in favour of the death penalty. And there are 5 marshals, and I sort of view Ney's trial and his sentence, sorry, is what I'm trying to say, as a real sort of character test for some of the marshals. So Marmont, who was Ney's guest, had dined at his house, was a friend of Ney and his wife. Marmont, Victor, Serrudier, Kellerman, Perignon. All 5 of them voted twice for his death.
It's not a good look, is it? And it's a very sad end for a guy who showed remarkable bravery, but as we've said, at times could be his own worst enemy. Rachael, it's been an absolute joy as ever. Thank you so much for sharing your incredible depth of knowledge on Ney with us. I know the listeners love these episodes, so I'll look forward to doing another one of these with you very soon.
Thank you.
What did you think of this episode? If you're listening on Spotify, you can now post your comments and questions, and we'll get back to you. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much, much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late March 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Ian Harding, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Darla Vincent, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlem, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, and Wojciech Stefanovic. The Admirals, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachael Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff, that's Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.